The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is a year old, and it's being talked about more than the upcoming Elden Ring DLC. The Elden Ring DLC actually got out overshadowed by Tifa's titties in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? Tifa's titties got more views on YouTube than the Elden Ring DLC did. And don't try and deny it. Don't try and like say, well, actually, the Elden Ring trailer was reacted to several times by YouTubers that nobody cares, but nobody cares about that. Like nobody cares about the views in general. Like I'm not sitting here saying that like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is bigger than Elden Ring or something. My point is that like views on YouTube don't matter at all, right? Tifa's titties overshadowed the Elden Ring DLC trailer because Tifa's titties are actually nice to look at. They actually look like they belong. They could be in real life, right? It looks like you can almost like reach out and touch them on the screen. Like if you just go out and buy some 3D glasses from Sony, like you're gonna be able to see those puppies just like jiggling in your face, right? Like again, that is that is a cope, you know? Like that's never actually gonna happen. But at the same time, there's a reason that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was so popular when it was first shown off. They jiggled those puppies in your face, right? And it's the with Elden Ring, it's like the same kind of thing, right? Where like people say like, oh, it's Elden Ring, From Slop, they put out the best games ever made. I don't even play anything else, but I just know From Slop makes the best. And like you look at the trailer and you're just kind of like, oh, it's more of the same. Okay. Well, I guess I'm still excited. I guess. I bet Harmon Smith is seething. I bet Harmon Smith is upset about the Elden Ring trailer. Meanwhile, I'm like sitting here talking about like Tifa's titties, right? Like I'm sitting here talking about Unicorn Overlord and Princess Peach Showtime. Like I did not give a shit about the Elden Ring DLC, and the reason for that being is that it wasn't relevant, right? This is the interesting thing about Elden Ring is that I do think the majority of the audience only bought it out of hype. They only bought it because it was the new big thing. It was like being backed by George R. R. Martin. It had a major ad campaign behind it. Like, there was this major like shill campaign behind the Elden Ring, right? People were legit stoked for it. And then it came out, it was disappointing. Millions of people walked away thinking that like, wow, that was it. It wasn't my kind of game, but whatever. And a lot of those people never even beat it. And like I ask you, like, how many how many people who did not beat Elden Ring are going to go out and play the DLC? No one, right? The DLC for Elden Ring, from Slot games have traditionally been very well received, but they don't necessarily like bring in a new player base, right? Because they're like essentially made for people who the kind of person who like does everything else in the base game, which is a very small niche portion of the gaming population, right? Like nobody is going to go through all of the Elden Ring DLC if they haven't actually beaten the game. Like why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. It's a complete waste of money. It's a complete waste of time. There's no reason to like buy the expansion if you never even finish the base game. And I think it's safe to say that the majority member of the something like 90% of the gaming audience who bought into the Elden Ring hype, probably more like 95 if we're being generous. Like 95% of the gaming population, like they never finished the game. They never beat the first boss. They never figured out what they were supposed to do. They never got into the game. And as a result of that, they're not going to be interested in the DLC. And what has that led to? Right? People got bored of Elden Ring and they went over to Zelda. And people realized that, like, wow, Zelda is a lot more fun, right? You can do a lot more stuff. Like, there's this cool building. There are these like cool areas to explore. Like, it has a better plot. More interesting characters, mechanics. Whoa, I can fly around in circles around a mountain and like fight a giant dragon. Like Tears of the Kingdom is infinitely better than Elden Ring. And the only reason you would ever think otherwise is if you hadn't played Tears of the Kingdom, right? That was kind of the gist of it, right? But over the past year, as people like slowly started accepting that Tears of the Kingdom was a great game, like people are slowly beginning to talk about like how great it was. Its amazing moments, the Master Sword pull, the dive at the end, like this and that, and just like all these phenomenal things that just made Tears of the Kingdom what it is, right? Like there's so much about Tears of the Kingdom though, which I would argue makes it like one of the best games ever made, right? Just like Breath of the Wild before it. But right now we're in this like weird phase of denial from like the Pretendos and like the FromSoft fanboys is that they don't want to admit it's true, right? They don't want to admit that like Dark Souls isn't appealing to everyone and that it's kind of a niche thing. They kind of do this thing where like they assume if that you're not into Dark Souls that you just haven't been initiated yet, that you've just been like filtered, that you just don't know how to play the game or whatever. No, like I've played through Dark Souls. I don't enjoy it, right? Like that's the reality. Like that kind of thing is like sacrilegious to them. Like admitting that you've beaten Dark Souls and then just going like, yeah, I didn't enjoy it. Like that is like the craziest thing they can possibly hear, right? Like to them, like Dark Souls is like the only game you should play, right? And the reality is that if you ever actually like go outside that bubble, if you play games like Ys or Zelda or like anything, like you're gonna find like a treasure trove of better games out there. It's shocking how desperate the FromSlot fans are to try to keep Elden Ring relevant in 2024, right? It's one of those situations where you're just kind of like feeling bad for them because they gaslit themselves into thinking this was like one of the best games of 2022. They gaslit themselves into thinking this was one of the best games ever made. Like they legit thought this was going to beat out Zelda. This is going to be more popular than Tears of the Kingdom, but it's not. It isn't. It never will be. And that fact becomes more and more obvious with each passing year, right? Not only are people talking about like Tears of the Kingdom, they're talking about older Zelda games, right? Like people are getting into like the Oracle games and like Ocarina. We're in that age now where people who grew up with Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are trying to tell us that those games were like misunderstood masterpieces and that like the new ones have lost the series identity, right? Like like we're in that era now. Like we're in that phase where like the people who grew up with those games are like trying to attack the old ones. Just like how the old audience used to attack Ocarina and like the new wave of games, right? Like history repeats itself in this regard. But I think this time we hardcore fans like understand like people who have been around the block a few times like we know how to handle this stuff, right? Like we know like these guys are just fanboys who are blinded by nostalgia who don't really understand Zelda, not really. Right? They're fans, there's no denying it, but at the same time like there are lots of good Zelda games out there. And disparaging Zelda to try and prop something else up is it's never gonna work out for you or for like anyone else. You're gonna have to compete with like the most successful fantasy video game franchise ever, and that just isn't gonna happen. Witcher 3 couldn't do it, Dark Cloud couldn't do it, like Skyrim couldn't do it, right? You really believe that Elden Ring is going to be more relevant than Zelda 20 years from now? No, it's not gonna happen. It's already been dead, buried, and forgotten, right? Just like Game of Thrones, just like George R. R. Martin, just like Dark Souls. The first flame is finally dying out on your irrelevant video game development studio.